ourselves have been refugees, and our Torah commands us to have sympathy and for the refugee and to love the refugee because we know that experience so well. At KAM Isaiah Israel, we have worked at various times in our history to help those who are refugees as well. We did work in the 1980s, and then most recently partnering with the Hyde Park Refugee Project. As most of you probably know, the last, say 4 years has been a challenging time to try and do work for and with refugees because of the perspective, I'll say, that the administration had. I know that our synagogue is going to be working to try and move us in a new direction as the new administration tries to move things along. But today we're going to be taking kind of a look at how US law has developed through time, and then we're going to have the experience of 2 individual Jewish refugee families. We're joined by Susan Zesch, who is an immigration scholar, activist, and attorney. She is on the faculty of the University of Chicago, and she is a member here at KAM Isaiah Israel as well. We're also joined by Fred Wellish. He's a pro bono attorney with the National Immigrant Justice Center. He's a retired member of DePaul University faculty and a member of the Jewish Reconstructionist Congregation of Evanston. We also have Ruth Bloom. She is a retired medical laboratory administrator from the University of Chicago Hospitals. She is also a member of KAM Isaiah Israel. And her parents were members of Congregation Habonim in New York City, which was founded by refugees from Nazi Germany. Fred and Ruth are gonna share stories of their respective families' experiences trying to leave Europe in the 1930s. And we will have a Q&A session afterwards. I'm going to invite you to submit questions that you have in the chat. You'll probably notice that if you've tried to unmute, that you're not able to. And that way we're going to be able to listen to our presenters without any kind of interruption. But if you have a question, go ahead and drop it into the chat and we'll be able to address those at the end. I haven't been able to see if this person has logged on, but I do want to mention Tony Preckwinkle, the Cook County Board President, did register for this session. And Tony, if you're with us, we are very, very glad that you're able to join us. You're very, very welcome, of course. So now I'm going to turn it over to you, Susan.
Thank you. Good morning. And this is our pre-game show, I guess. So welcome to everyone who's here to talk about a topic which has historical resonance and really a lot of relevance for today. So if Cassie could put up my slides, I'd be ready to start. I'm going to talk about how US immigration law impacted the experience of refugees trying to escape from Europe, both in the pre-war period as the shadow of the Holocaust was coming over them and during the war. Cassie, you can go to the next slide. As Jewish refugees are trying to escape the Nazis, there are basically 2 pieces of US law that work together to block their entry. Both of these pieces of law had their origins in are products of the US and global rise of the so-called science of eugenics, which was popular in the late 19th and right through the mid 20th century. And eugenics is really, I think, a euphemism for white supremacy. How did that manifest itself in US immigration law? Well, first of all, as many of you know, the Congress started wide-ranging exclusion of immigrants from Asia in the 1880s, starting with the Chinese. And they didn't exclude the Japanese for a while because Japan was a world power. But by 1907, pretty much all immigration from Asia had been excluded. So and Asians made ineligible for citizenship, even if they managed to be legally in the United States or born here, or ineligible to naturalize. So you have this first wave of racialized exclusion. Then Congress got around to, after this, the Dillingham Commission in 1907, which I have a circler on, enacting a number of provisions which were supposed to bar admission based on the individual characteristics of a particular immigrant or refugee. And likely to become a public charge, was put in US law in 1908 and is still a tool that can be wielded by consular officials with their discretion when they are determining whether someone can come into the United States. Some of the other categories of qualifications were whether someone was a criminal, whether they were an anarchist, whether they were a prostitute, whether they were literate. But in the case of the Jewish refugees trying to come in, likely to be a public charge was a very powerful tool wielded by the consular corps in Europe. And that was a procedural change that happened in the 20s that also really impacted the possibilities of admission for people seeking to be refugees. Instead of immigrants arriving at Ellis Island or in Galveston, Texas, or at the port of San Francisco, decisions on whether someone could even get on a ship to travel to the United States were now being made offshore in US consulates in Europe, and were basically unreviewable by US courts because they were taking place outside the US. This, unfortunately, is a feature of the law that we still have with us today. Now, the other major piece of law that had a huge impact on Jews being able to come to the US, and particularly impacted the over 3 million Jews in Poland, which is where most of my family is from, were the National Origins Acts passed in 1922 and 1924. And the National Origins Acts were passed in a mood of what today I would call Make America White Again. What they did was that they imposed quotas on people coming from countries in Eastern and Southern Europe, so that who were not really considered white at the time. And the successful proponents of the legislation first passed a series of quotas in 1922 based on the representation of certain national groups in the white population in the United States in 1910, I believe it was. And then in 1924, they rolled it back to the 19th century level. So in other words, they were trying to make America look like it used to look, and that those laws operated to bar the entry of many, many would-be refugees. Cassie, we can go to the next slide. So you have this legal system in place, and you're going to hear two very moving and interesting stories from Fred and Ruth about how they impacted their families, who were relatively prosperous and trying to leave from Germany and Austria, but still were absolutely blocked by, at least parts of the family, by these laws. The other thing that happened was during the 1920s and into the 30s and during the war, Congress rejected any exceptions to these 1920s quotas. In 1939, Congress explicitly defeated a piece of legislation which would have brought Jewish orphans in from Germany on the grounds that it would have upset the quota system. The other thing that happened due to the quotas in the US was the development of Jewish communities in Latin America during the 1920s forward. So the Jewish communities grow in Argentina, Mexico, Uruguay, Colombia, and become places of refuge for families trying to get out of Europe, at least before travel was completely cut off in the late night, well, the wars break out in 1939. But it's a sort of consistent exclusionist, and we can label it anti-Semitic attitude among consular officials and among the US government mechanisms in general that refuses to allow the landing of the SS St. Louis and other noted incidents of turning away refugees. Now, there was one solution that was put together in Franklin Roosevelt's State Department that I thought was entirely a piece of fiction when I read Michael Chabon's book, The Yiddish Policemen's Union. But yes, in fact, there was a humanitarian proposal to bring in 1 or 2 million Jewish refugees from Europe to settle them in Alaska, just as you read about in that book. It failed. It never happened. Next slide. So we have the consequences that Ruth and Fred are going to tell you about in their family stories. We have the refusal to recognize the genocide of the Jews until fairly late in the war. And then finally, when the war is over and the horrors of the concentration camps are revealed to the American public, there's a push in the US to do something for the survivors. And the push to do something for the Jewish survivors is also helped by the fact that there are many Eastern European refugees who are not Jewish, who are fleeing the institution of communist governments in their countries, unfortunately among them many fascists who later settle on the southwest side of Chicago. But we do get enough of a coalition to get the Displaced Persons Act passed in 1948. And that's how a bunch of my surviving relatives from the Lodz Ghetto get into Chicago and begin to work in bakeries and delicatessens all over the city. That's another story I'm going to tell at a program on April 9th, so come back for that. But when the Displaced Persons Act was passed, President Harry Truman was very disappointed in it because it had been begrudgingly passed by a Republican Congress. And Truman's signing statement has some actually remarkable language in it. This bill discriminates in callous fashion against displaced persons of the Jewish faith. This brutal fact cannot be obscured by the maze of technicalities in the bill or by the protestations of some of its sponsors. Now, Truman signed the act. Jews started to be admitted to the United States, although in very small numbers. But by 1950, when the Democrats took control of both houses of Congress, Truman and the Democrats were able to liberalize the provisions and bring even more Jewish refugees in. Next slide. Now, I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of changes in the law bringing us up till today. In 1965, those hated national origins quotas were finally eliminated. It was part of a generalized push to de-racialize US legislation as part of the civil rights movement. Truman and company had tried to do this with the help of the National Council of Jewish Women in the 1952 revision of immigration laws, but it failed. But finally, in 65, the National Origins Act quotas are defeated and Asian exclusion included with that. In the 1970s, how did we get Jews to come in from the Soviet Union? We still didn't have a law governing people coming here as refugees. And so the first groups of Soviet Jews came in under the president's broad power to parole or admit into the United States on a conditional basis any person whose entry is necessary for US public interest. And so the first Soviet Jews came in under the presidential parole policy. But later, with the Jackson-Vanik Amendment of the Trade Act of 1974, many more Soviet Jews were able to come in and resettle. And then finally, in 1980, Congress decides to take US immigration law off of its Cold War footing. The Hungarians also came under parole power in the 50s. That's how some of women who married into my family arrived in the US. But in 1980, we finally get a Refugee Act, which establishes a system of annual admissions of refugees from abroad and allows anyone who shows up at the US border to apply for asylum at a US border station or appears in our territory, no matter how they got here. The quotas under this for overseas admissions are sent by presidential order, and we know that President Biden is going to bring this law back to life when President Trump had basically pretty much killed it by getting the quotas down to about zero in collaboration with that Shonda for the Goy and Stephen Miller. Okay, well, one last fact I'm going to leave you with. The US does have a very generous system of bringing in refugees from abroad, but 90% of asylum seekers in the world, and I haven't worked out the percentages for the US, but it's the majority, are still people who have to show up either with nothing at a border or sneak in or get into somebody else's territory on a rather chancy status in order to be able to apply. So I'm going to turn the program over to Fred Wellish, from JRC, and who is a volunteer lawyer with National Immigrant Justice Center and former faculty member from DePaul, to tell you his stories. I'll be back to monitor the Q&A. Please put your questions in the chat. Fred.
Thank you, Susan. And thanks to Ruth Bloom, Rabbi Reeves, and KAM Isaiah Israel for inviting me to share these stories. One of success, the other of sorrow, both out of Vienna, Austria. I grew up in Miami, Florida, a child of Holocaust survivors. And I'm going to tell you the story of my parents and my maternal grandparents using letters and other documents that I inherited after my father's death in 1982. The letters are a remarkable two-way correspondence between my parents, writing first from Switzerland and then America, and my maternal grandparents in Vienna, spanning from August 1938 through September 1941. In 2018, I donated the collection to the U.S. Holocaust Museum and Memorial, where it has been digitized and is now fully online. These are my parents, Kurt and Frida Wellisch, née Auerbach. My father, Kurt, was a practicing lawyer in Vienna. My mother, Frida, worked in her parents' hat factory as a sewer and later as a manager. They were married on June 13th, 1937. This is their wedding photo. And this is a picture of the Stadttempel where they were married, with its beautiful domed ceiling replicating the sky and stars. The Stadttempel was the only synagogue in Vienna not destroyed on Kristallnacht because it shared space in a courtyard building with apartments occupied by non-Jewish residents. Both then and now, it also housed the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde, or Jewish Community Center, which was charged with administering and processing Jewish immigration when it was still possible. In 1993, my wife Edie and I visited Vienna and were able to observe Kol Nidre, where my parents had celebrated their wedding 56 years earlier. The Anschluss, or annexation of Austria, occurred on March 12, 1938. Less than 2 months later, on May 4th, and after several meetings with the Gestapo, my father was arrested in the sweep of Jewish professionals and placed in what the Nazis euphemistically called protective custody. This slide that you're looking at is a page from his lawyer's date book or diary from May of 1938. If you look here on May 2nd, you'll see a couple of meetings with NSDAP officials, that Nazi Party officials, and then on May 4th, you see that my father has written the word Gestapo and next to it, the word Verhaftung, which means arrest. He would remain in various Viennese jails for 6 weeks, corresponding with my mother, and they would be forced to spend their first anniversary apart from each other. Here is his first postcard to my mother. I've always been struck in this particular postcard by a certain mundane, a contrast between his request that my mother bring certain mundane necessities with her on her first visit to him: a toothbrush, toothpaste, soap, washcloth, pajamas, etc., and his simple but poignant declaration at the end of the postcard down here: Ich habe nichts getan und bin rein. Kisses, Kurt, I have done nothing wrong and I am innocent. My father's release from custody was conditioned on him and my mother leaving the country. So while he was in jail, my mother filled out immigration questionnaires at the Jewish Community Center on behalf of herself, my father, and his brother Heinz. Here's a third page from her own questionnaire. I'm going to zero in on this. The top question asks where they would like to immigrate to, or where she would like to immigrate to. And she writes, most of all to Egypt. Imagine my surprise when I received that document and read that. And then America, Australia, Turkey. Second question asks how she's going to fend for herself, or what for her upkeep, how she's going to support herself. And her answer is to open up a store as a milliner. Then here you have a box that has her various people she knows in these various countries that she's indicated in the first question. You know, you've got USA, you've got Heliopolis, which is a suburb of Cairo, New York City, Sydney, and Melbourne, Australia. Down here, she lists her relatives, and they are simply my father, Kurt Wellisch, and her parents, Regina and Ignaz Auerbach. And down here is the question, who would you like to immigrate now and who should leave later? And she answers, my father now, and the others, her parents, later. My father was released from custody on June 14th, the day after their first anniversary. While, in addition to filling out this questionnaire, my mother, or probably the Jewish community staff on her behalf, approached various consulates to secure temporary visas and was ultimately successful in getting ones for Switzerland. And as I said, my father was released 6 weeks later after those had been secured. On July 30th, he, my mother, and his brother Heinz boarded a plane to Venice. They remained in Italy for about 2 months, and on September 22nd arrived in Zurich, where they joined my paternal grandfather, Sam, who had left Vienna on a business trip earlier that year and decided not to return in light of what was going on. By the way, he remained in Switzerland throughout the war. My parents and Heinz, my father's brother, stayed in Switzerland for approximately 18 months, working at various odd jobs while they secured the necessary affidavits for immigration to the United States. And on May 1st, they sailed from Genoa on the Italian ocean liner, the SS Rex, arriving in New York on May 10th. This is a picture of them on the deck of the Rex. This is my father, this is my mother, and his brother Heinz between them. They remained in New York for about 6 weeks and then ultimately settled in Miami, Florida. My mother working as a milliner and sales clerk at a department store. And my father worked at various odd jobs, piano salesman and demonstrator. He was an excellent pianist, elevator operator, bookkeeper, and ultimately attended night school at the University of Miami, getting a BA in bachelor's administration and an American JD. He became a successful CPA and practicing attorney in Miami. These are the grandparents I never met. My mother's parents, Ignaz and Regina Auerbach. She was also known as Rosina. They were not as lucky as my parents. This is a picture of them on their 30th anniversary. As you have heard, my mother worked in a hat factory that was owned by, co-owned, a family hat factory co-owned by her father, Ignaz, in central Vienna. This obviously seems to be a bustling enterprise. This is a picture of the factory floor. And this is the retail counter at the front of the factory. The factory itself was expropriated by the Nazis in late 1939. Additionally, at about this time, Regina and Ignaz were moved from their residence in central Vienna to the second district, Leopoldstadt, across the Danube Canal. This district was the one to which all newly arrived Jews from Eastern Europe took up residence and ultimately became the ghetto to which the Nazis relocated all Jewish residents of Vienna before deporting them. Ignaz and Regina would be forced to move several times during their residency in Leopoldstadt. Here is a picture of the hallway of their last residence that I took while visiting Vienna again in 2016 with my wife Edie and daughter Julia. Unfortunately, we were not able to actually enter the apartment and walk the rooms that they lived in. I have not been able to discover what Ignaz and Regina's quota numbers were or how many earlier attempts were made to get them out of Austria, but it is clear from the correspondence that in the winter and spring of 1941, these efforts intensified. On January 15th, 1941, Ignaz mails my parents in Florida the American consulate's denial of their request for visas with the specific grounds for denial checked off. This is what you're looking at here, these check marks. There's a list of possible grounds for denial, and these check marks indicate the American consulate's specific grounds in this case, which included insufficient finances for the support of my grandparents and outdated documents having no evidentiary values, those documents having been sent by people signing affidavits on their behalf from the United States. You'll notice there's also a handwritten note at the bottom from my grandfather, which, like so many of the other letters coming out of Vienna, I've not been able to decipher because they are written in a script called Sutherland, which was taught to Austrian children in late 19th, early 20th century Austria. In early February 1941, my father and mother from Florida submit additional supporting evidence in the form of an affidavit for her parents' requests for a visa. As you can see from this slide, they list various things. They list that that their jewelry and that they've sent some letters attesting to their work. They say here they have permanent jobs. Since we started to work, we have never changed our positions. We were enabled to resettle ourselves easily. We got a nice and comfortable 5-room apartment in a very good residential section of Miami. We have a year-round lease and can accommodate Frida Wellish Auerbach's parents in our own house. So our professional positions and our spacious homes will make it possible to take care of them so that, and here is the language that Susan referred to earlier, they will never be any burden to any public institution, to any city, county, or state, nor to anyone else. And then they talk about the supporting documents, which I'll show you in a minute. And they end by saying, knowing that Frida's parents' quota numbers have been in turn, I think they mean in line, for a long time, we are trusting in you and hopeful that you will grant them the visas without further delay. And they close by saying that Frida is their only daughter, their only child, and she has not seen them for 2 years. This is this is the accompanying letter that lists their professions at the time. My mother is a milliner in a department store in Miami called Hartley's, and my father is a salesman and demonstrator at a piano store called Philpotts. Their joint income, $25 weekly, letters attached. I don't have those letters. And jewelry and diamonds, the value of which is appraised at $1,530. And they list the fact that they own a Chevrolet as well. On March 5th, Ignaz and Regina receive a second denial from the consulate, submitted on the grounds that the proof submitted by my parents for the support of my grandparents is insufficient. It asks that if you look at number 4, C, that the income that they have mentioned from their respective jobs be verified by a 1940 income tax return, and that the assets that they have described, the diamonds, the Chevrolet, that sort of thing, be verified by a bank or insurance company. That's number 5. And also number 6 states that my parents should, and I quote, specifically describe how they will provide for you and your family, whether you will live with them and be fed by them, and how much of their income will be available for you. This despite the fact that my parents' letter indicated they had plenty of room, 5-room apartment, and their incomes were solid incomes. It is at this point in the spring of 1941 that my paternal grandfather, Sam, from Switzerland, takes a more active role in the correspondence and in strategizing how to get Ignaz and Regina out of Vienna. This is a picture of his Swiss identity card. And these are some of the letters that went back and forth in the spring of 1941, postcards, letters. In March, Sam books passage for Ignaz and Regina on the Portuguese ship Serpa Pinto for its May 24th sailing from Lisbon to New York, and even confirms that booking with a telegram to the United States consulate. That ship never sails to the US. Later that month, he suggests that Ignaz and Regina try to get Czech visas, since both of them were born in Czechoslovakia. He also mentioned Shanghai as another way of getting to the United States, and discusses the option of Regina and Ignaz boarding a Spanish ship after learning that the Portuguese are no longer issuing port visas. On July 1st, the American consulate was closed in Vienna, and all requests for visas needed to be routed through the United States. And that's when the noose tightens. There is not much correspondence after July 1st, and all attempts to get my grandparents out ultimately failed. This is the last letter we have from them, dated September 18th, 1941, a month before they were deported to Łódź, Poland, on transport number 5 out of Vienna. The Jews from the West, Berlin, Vienna, Prague, did not stay long in Łódź. Most were deported within 6 months. This slide is a composite copy of 2 separate forms signed by a representative of the ghetto, of the elder of the office of the Lodz ghetto, the notorious Chaim Rumkowski. The top, dated December 23rd, 1941, is entitled Anmeldung, which essentially means registration, and is the date that my grandmother and grandfather moved into their last residence on the Rembrandtstrasse in Łódź, Poland. You can see they were there with 14 people in one room with no kitchen. It's signed by a representative of that office. And here is my grandmother's signature, Rosina Auerbach, at the bottom. The bottom slide is essentially, could be translated to mean deregistration. And it is actually their death warrant, because it is the date that she, my grandfather, were deported from Łódź to their deaths at Chełmno, May 4th, 1942. Again, there is a signature of a representative of the office of the oldest elders of the Jews. The date, my grandmother's signature, does not appear. At the beginning of this presentation, I indicated that the documents I would use came from the collection I inherited from my father in 1982, not these 2. These came as a result of years of independent research I did in archives and through tracing services like the International Red Cross. You see, my mother always wanted to place her memorial plaques to her parents in the temple we belonged to in Miami, but she was never able to determine the exact date of her parents' death. These documents enabled her to do that and to at least give her some sense of finality. And it has helped preserve the memory of my grandparents in my heart and mind, and in the hearts and minds of my daughters, Rebecca and Julia. I would like to turn over the program to Ruth Bloom now.
Good morning, and thank you, Fred. Both of my parents, Joseph Abraham Winter and Ursula Hefter, were born in Germany, but they only met and married after the war in 1947 in New York City. Their paths out of Germany were quite different. Both were fraught with difficulties and varying degrees of success. I will begin with my mother's journey. Born in Berlin in 1923, my mother moved with her parents to the small town of Hattingen in the 1930s to help manage the department store that was owned by her grandparents. This is an image from her photo album. This is a picture of the department store, the Gebrüder Kaufmann, which was on the town square of the small town of Hattingen. And my parents, my mother and her parents and her grandmother lived on the second floor above the store, as it were. Her grandfather had passed away in 1930. On the night of Kristallnacht in November 1938, the store was targeted and windows and doors were broken. Her father, Jacob Hefter, my grandfather, was picked up by the Gestapo. 6 weeks later, on the last night of Hanukkah, there was a knock at the door, and her father returned, emaciated and released from a concentration camp on the condition that he leave the country within a matter of weeks. The department store, its contents, many of their household goods had to be sold cheaply, of course, and arrangements for departure made. Releasing people who had property of value was a common pattern at the time. A man who lodged with this family on the 3rd floor of the house, who announced himself to the Gestapo on Kristallnacht as Jewish, he was also taken and he never returned. On January 6, 1939, my mother, just shy of her 16th birthday, was sent alone on a kinder transport to a summer camp in the North Sea in Holland for safety. Of course, this was January, so summer camp, it was chilly there. You see a picture of my mother with a young man who she calls her great love later in life when she was looking back at her photos. She was 16 after all. I do not know by whom this particular kinder transport was sponsored. Many were sponsored by groups sending the kids to England, but in this case, they went to the North Sea in Holland. Fortunately, her parents and her grandmother were able to quickly get visas to Colombia, South America for the family. 4 months later, they met my mother in Amsterdam on May 5th, 1939, and they departed all together on the SS Clara for Bogota, Colombia. Cassie, would you please stop the share? I do not know if the family had considered leaving Germany before Kristallnacht, but the choice was obvious for 2 reasons. First, because my mother, Uncle Wilhelm, had emigrated to Bogota, Colombia in 1933. And second, because as Susan mentioned in her presentation, immigration to Latin America was not limited by quotas and visas could be obtained quickly, which is probably also why Uncle Willem immigrated there too in 1933. My mother's parents were not very happy in Colombia, and ultimately the family was able to immigrate to New York City in July 1940. My mother did well in New York. She got her GED and took classes at the New School in New York City. Her father helped her start her own dressmaking shop, and she married my father in October 1947. After my father's death in 2003, my mother moved to Chicago. Her grandmother and uncle continued to make their home in Bogota, Colombia, and eventually died there. Cassie, can you confirm that the screen share has been stopped? I'm unable to see myself and get back to my image, but I can continue talking if the screen share is off.
It's off.
Thank you. So now I'll talk about my father's journey. My father was on one of the last ships out of Genoa to New York City. In fact, it was just 2 weeks after Fred Relish's parents left from the very same port. What a coincidence. As I was growing up, my father did not share many details with my brother and me of how he managed to leave Germany. Later in life, he did speak about his experiences publicly and recorded several interviews. I'm now in the process of piecing together his journey from the interviews, letters and documents that he apparently brought with him from Germany, along with photo albums and some key Stuttgart newspapers from 1938 through 1940. I don't know how he was able to fit everything into the one suitcase that he said he was allowed to take with him when he left Germany. My father and his sister were born in Stuttgart, Germany. However, their parents were born and married in Suceava, Romania, in the Bukovina region. Therefore, both he and his sister were also considered Romanian at the time. When my father requested a Romanian passport, the embassy refused to issue one to him because he had not completed his military service. He was 24 at the time. Instead, my father was able to obtain a stateless passport, which he mentions in several letters. As Susan mentioned in her presentation, the US did have quotas for immigration, which were based on place of birth. My father says decisive in a letter. The good news was that the German quota was actually much higher than the Romanian quota. With the stateless passport in hand, my father started the task of obtaining further documentation to support his visa application. Based on carbon copies of the documents that my father seems to have prepared for this, the process was like an extensive job application or resume. Education history, including grades, employment history, references, and significantly, in addition, affidavits of sponsorship, preferably from US citizens. All documents relating to sponsorship had to be notarized. He first reached out to his brother, Uncle Adolf Hellman. Uncle Adolf and his family had immigrated to Palestine in 1936 and only immigrated to New York City in early 1937. In a letter dated February 11th, 1939, to a former co-worker, a Mr. Gans, who immigrated to the USA in 1936, my father describes the deterioration of his career as a manager in an iron import-export business, as various Nazi decrees Aryanized businesses and limited other employment opportunities for Jews. A friend of mine who helped my mother and I with some of the translation was surprised to actually see in print the use of the word Aryanized or Aryanized in this letter. My father's last position, which started in January 1939, was unusual and quite fortuitous. He worked in the Mittelstelle, or middle place, under Herr Director Karl Adler. This office seems to have acted as an adjunct to the Hilfsverein Jewish Help Agency, which was overwhelmed handling immigration applications. It functioned in the offices of the Oberrat, that is the Oberrat der Israelitische Religionsgemeinschaft, which was a federal office for the attention to Jewish affairs. The Oberrat happened to be in the same building and on the same floor as a Gestapo office and the US consular office in Stuttgart. The staff in the Mittelstelle assisted people in preparing visa applications to submit to the US consulate and was able, in fact, to report, in quotes, emergency cases in person by walking down the hall to present papers to literally to the appropriate office. For many years, my father's mother operated an egg and staples stall at the Stuttgart Markthalle, or market hall. As my father says, she was well liked. Even so, on the morning after Kristallnacht, my father and my grandmother arrived at the Markthalle to find her stall completely trashed. Others looked on silently as they turned around and left, never to return. Again, in the same letter to Mr. Gans, he describes the situation facing people trying to emigrate to the US. And this time I quote from the letter. Since July of last year, every immigrant to the USA must register at the consulate. Up to now, already 45,000 numbers have been issued at the Stuttgart consulate. Right now, number 6,000, exclamation point, is coming up, and about every month, about 400 to 500 people are taken care of. Can you imagine the desperation when somebody has the number 10,000 and beyond? It doesn't matter if someone has an affidavit or not. The consulate goes by the registration number and makes no exception. Through my work there, through my work in the Mittelstelle, I am quite well acquainted with the whole procedure. I can only say that it is horrible. Through a lucky chance, I have received number 5,500, and therefore it is possible that I will soon be called. What has to happen with the people who must wait 2, 3, or more years is not yet clear. And yet you have heard yourself that attempts are being made to find a solution. My mother, unfortunately, sits at home and manages the borders. Since we don't have much cash, you can well imagine that one doesn't feel very good. My sister found a job in a Jewish guest house and earns a few marks. How long one will be able to hold out, one cannot say. And so the story continues. My father's uncle's sponsorship, Uncle Adolf's sponsorship, was deemed insufficient since he had only recently emigrated to New York. So my father sought other sponsors for himself and his sister and his mother. I have originals and carbon copies of many letters filed alphabetically by correspondent in reverse date order in a black binder, similar to the one that Fred inherited from his father. The letters my father wrote were urgent but respectful letters with explicit details about what needed to be done to provide an adequate sponsorship. After months of correspondence by my father with other potential sponsors and moving up in the queue, my father was given an interview at the US consulate in Berlin on August 29, 1939. His application was rejected, no reason stated. Eventually, through the Hilfsverein, he found out that the doctor who had screened him for the visa had noted a heart problem. In order to get the visa in spite of this, he had to come up with a $2,000 trust fund from someone in the US. As you can imagine, $2,000 in 1940 was quite a bit of money. So we are now in January 1940. Cassie, would you please share the screen again? On January 1940, he wrote a letter to a Mr. Meyer requesting the, such assistance such as the $2,000 trust fund. I don't know how that, whether he replied or not. Also during January 1940, Uncle Adolf arranged for funds for travel and urged him by telegram to make arrangements quickly. Finally, on February 16, 1940, the US consulate granted him a visa to the US. And then on May 17, 1940, my father boarded the SS Exeter, departing from Genoa, Italy. Once in the US, my father received perhaps 10 or so letters from his mother and sister via the Red Cross. Delivery was slow and delayed by censors. On December 1st, 1940, his sister, my aunt, wrote him a letter. In it, she mentions issues that are similar to the ones that Fred's relatives in Vienna encountered. On the screen, I have a short excerpt in German for those of you who, of the original, who are interested and can read German. But I will read to you in an English translation, just a bit of what she wrote. Dear Isu, now this time I want to start the letter writing. Indeed, I have good reason for this. 2 days ago, I received from the consulate a note indicating that my hopes for the moment have come to nothing. I write to you what the consulate informed me. I received again a Formula H, and there are various points which are not right. By Uncle Adolf are the numbers 1, 2, 4, and 5, and by Reuben 4, 5, 7. By number 1, it means the income of your guarantors is insufficient. Number 2, the financial support of the guarantors is insufficient. Number 4, your guarantor has no proof of firm financial undertaking presented, whereby it could be seen that their support in the United States is securely placed for quite a firm time. Number 5, one of the reasons your guarantors asserted to take over the support obligation, in the opinion of the consulate, was not convincing enough in order that the consulate could make the inference that he would in all probability provide the support for a rather indefinite time, especially since he is not obligated out of any close relationship. Number 7, the here produced guarantees and additional proof documents have lost their validity because they are out of date. Now I stand exactly where I was a year ago. My aunt continues, last week, Mother visited the Hilfsverein. Fräulein Jordan said to her that I need only a good guarantee from a relative, or I need from a stranger a voucher of support. Also, someone must put up a deposit of about $2,000. He wrote me once some time ago about Teacher Mayer that he might issue a voucher of support for me. Is he well-to-do enough that he could put up a deposit for me? Try again to come to an understanding with him. Or do you know someone else? Since you are making so many visits, you must certainly meet somebody, exclamation point. Or have you already followed us, forgotten us here like all the others? 2 question marks. I hope not. Herr Director Adler is going to get everything reissued again. Now her tone changes a bit. On Sunday, the 1st of December, we had a variety hour. It was very nice. The whole, to be sure, was only a dream. They showed us how easily and nicely one can, could get to America, and how nice it is on the steamer. She talks a bit more about life as it was. After this letter, he received one more letter from his mother, Sally Winter, dated January 1st, 1941. In it, she describes New Year's Eve, shared with friends in her apartment, playing pinochle, while his sister, has shut herself off in a separate room. Several friends add notes to the letter, and you can see here the last page of the letter where there are a couple of different notes from different people. I find it noteworthy that on in March 1941, just a few months after my father had arrived in New York City, he was drafted into the US Army and eventually recruited by Army intelligence. I find it noteworthy that on November 23rd, 1942, he was able to file a petition for naturalization and was given citizenship on the 24th of November while serving as a sergeant in Company K, 22nd Infantry at Camp Gordon, Augusta, Georgia. His mother and sister, my aunt and grandmother, continued to live openly in Stuttgart in southern Germany. As the story goes, my grandmother refused an offer to be hidden because she did not want to put her friend at risk. On June 17th, 1943, they were deported to Auschwitz. His father, who was estranged from the family, had been sent to a labor camp, and his fate is unknown. Cassie, please stop the share. Thank you for allowing me to honor my parents by telling their stories. And now we'll turn the screen back over to Susan Zesch, who will start our conversation with you, our listeners. Thank you.
Hi, those were wonderful stories. Thank you so much, Ruth and Fred. It really puts life on these sort of general principles and ideas to hear about what actually happened to people. So thank you for sharing. We had planned this program to go an hour. We are now just 2 minutes from an hour, but with the assumed permission of my co-panelists and the rabbi, let's do about 10 minutes of questions. I've culled some questions from the chat and some that came in earlier, and I'm just going to read quickly the names of people who submitted questions just to honor you, but I've smushed them together into categories, and they're all about law. No one is going to say, "Oh, Ruth, did that really happen?" Or "Fred, what was in that affidavit?" So I'll just try to answer them quickly. And thanks again to Ruth and Fred. So people who submitted questions: Ivan Vamos, Julia Wellish, Chuck Myers, Mark Rosenberg, Lawrence Grimm, and 3 people whose questions came in before the program, and when they were transmitted to me, they didn't have names on them. So thank you very much. One question, general one, asks, does this likely to be a public charge piece of law operate now? And are the documents requirements as stringent as were described in Ruth and Fred's narratives of what happened in the late 1930s? The answer is yes. And we know that under the Trump administration, the Department of State and DHS defined what classifies you as likely to become a public charge in ways that put many more people who are actually supporting themselves and their families, but perhaps had to get some kind of benefits program. They put them in much stricter terms. They raised the income levels and generated tremendous fear in immigrant communities that they shouldn't even apply for benefits programs they might be eligible for fear of ultimately being turned down as public charges. So we're hoping that the Biden administration is going to reverse that. There was another question about quotas. Post-war, did quotas prevent the entry of people from Latin America and China in the immediate post-war period? And I'm going to assume the question refers to Jewish refugees who had found sanctuary in Shanghai and other parts of China, and Jews from Latin America. Well, there was no quota on Latin American immigration. The way that US officials from the 1920s right through till 1965 controlled immigration from Latin America was by turning off and turning on their discretion with respect to public charge. When they wanted to slow down people coming in, they would just find people who were likely to become a public charge. When the doors were open, usually because of labor needs, then it was much easier to get in because there weren't any quotas. From China, I'm assuming Jewish refugees, because born in China, we developed a very teeny quota to allow immigration from China starting in 1940, because it was kind of embarrassing because China was our ally in Asia, that we had an absolute bar on Chinese coming in. But China did not really get a full quota of being able to send immigrants to the United States until 1965. So Jews from China, yes, could come in because the quotas had to do with place of birth and national origins. So they would have gotten in under those rather than in the post-war period, rather than in a quota from China. Just to let you know how the quotas operate now, in 1965, as I said in my first presentation, we de-racialized the way quotas were done. Congress did that. And what they did was they set up what is now a maximum of 25,000 possible immigrants per year, per country around the world, without regard to population of that country. So the same quota applies to a small South Pacific nation as it does to India. And with a certain percentage per year in certain categories, depending on your family relationship to someone in the US or your work skills. Now, Congress has always liked true love. And so people who immigrate through marriage are not considered part of those country quotas. But for many countries where there has been a large demand in visas, the numbers have been very high. In fact, one of the things on the agenda of the Biden administration is to release, you have to do this through Congress. You can't do this through executive order. Congress would have to decree that the quota system set up in 1965 needs to be revised, and revised in a certain way so that the 3.6 million people who are qualified to immigrate to the United States based on their family relations or their jobs and are stuck on waiting lists would be able to immigrate to the US. For example, if you are the unmarried adult child of a permanent US citizen and you're originally from Mexico, you had to have gotten on that list since in 1999. And it moves so slowly that there's current stuff in the press that many of the 3.6 million people on the list will die before they get to the top of the list. And in fact, I remember a friend of mine joking some years ago that if you were on the list of brothers and sisters from Mexico, at least they could make it so you could bequeath your place in line to your children, because you were never going to get there. So the Biden administration does have this on the agenda. It's going to be a public discussion over the next several months at least, and you have a little information to watch that. What about discrimination in the bureaucracy? Masked discrimination was the term that the questioner used then and now. Well, yeah, it is very similar. Consular decisions outside the United States are still not reviewable. We can see that the courts will place some limit on discretionary decisions made by officials in the US, so setting up certain kinds of regulations or the first versions of the Muslim ban, where that discrimination is explicit. But the Supreme Court finally allowed, as you remember, Muslim ban 3.0 to get by because they put some non-Muslim countries on the list. I think Venezuela was one of them. But and that, of course, has been revoked already by the Biden administration. But there still are going to be problems with rank and file frontline officers, more in the Border Patrol than in the consular posts abroad, but having that kind of racism-informed, basically unreviewable discretion. So let me just see if there's any other. Someone is available to lecture on the Shanghai Ghetto, Helene Herman. Oh, is Fred on the screen while I'm talking? Go to gallery, then you can see me talking. And so I think that's it for questions. We do have another program coming up on April 9th that you will hear more about in the future. And we're very happy to have you. And now I'm going to turn to Ruth, who really was the heart and soul and brains behind the organization of this program, for which we were very grateful, and ask her to close us out. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Fred. And thank you, Rabbi Reeves, as well. And thank you to all of you who joined us virtually this morning. For me, Susan's excellent presentation and follow-up answers to questions has deepened my understanding of the context of my parents' journey in the context of US law and its application in the 1930s. And of course, now looking forward, I understand better what I should be alert to in the coming months with regard to improvement and of the current situation with regard to immigration to the United States. We invite you to join us again for a virtual program commemorating the Shoah on Wednesday evening, April 7th. It's a Wednesday evening. And join us, please, for an hour of more family stories, perhaps not in as great detail, but definitely very poignant and targeted, for stories, music, images, and prayer. For over 30 years, this particular event has been planned by a collaborative group of representatives from several Jewish organizations in Hyde Park and Kenwood communities of Chicago. My mother, Ursula Winter, who many of you know, often spoke at these events after she moved to Chicago in 2003. Sometimes she told a story from her experiences in Germany, but sometimes she reminded us to forgive, but not forget. She recognized and respected the possibility of change in people and government administration. We welcome your follow-up questions in the future, and we will send you a link to a recording of today's session, which will include the chats, and more details about the event on April 7th. We'll send that shortly. So thank you all again for joining us, and stay safe and sane.